Hello, everybody. Welcome to Orbit series on how to write your first sci-fi fantasy novel. Today, we're talking about settings and setting your story. And we have a wonderful panel with us today. I'm Lauren Panapinto. I'm the creative director of Orbit Books. So if you've seen a map in an Orbit book or most of the covers, I will have had something to do with that. And on our panel today, we have Alastair Reynolds, is the author of a number of science fiction series and novels, including Revelation Space and the Revenger series. Constance Sayers is the author of several historical and contemporary fantasy novels, including A Witch in Time, The Ladies of the Secret Circus, and the upcoming Star in the Strange Moon, out this month from Red Hook. Alex Jennings is the author of the Ray Bradbury Prize nominee in contemporary fantasy, The Ballad of Perilous Graves. And Django Wexler is the author of Ashes of the Sun and the upcoming How to Become the Dark Lord and Die Trying. And we thank Django for popping in. R.S. Ford had a personal emergency, and Django is stepped in to save the day. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for being on this panel and helping all these 1,000 or more folks who are registered for this, helping them write their first novel. And it is NaNoWriMo month. So I know a lot of people are furiously writing. So to kick it off, I'm just going to ask you guys to tell the audience a little bit about your books or a book, because I know some of you have different settings, a little bit about your worlds. And Connie, we'll start with you.
Yep, great. So I have written 3 books. The first one was A Witch in Time, which had 4 time periods: Belle Epoque Paris, Hollywood in the 1930s, Towson 1970s, and modern day Washington. Ladies of the Secret Circus had a setting of rural Virginia, Paris, France, historic 1925 and modern day. And then I had a circus set in the 7th layer of hell. So that was a little bit different than what I had normally done. And then The Star and the Strange Moon, which does come out in 2 weeks, was set in the 1960s in France. And then inside a film, which is Gothic. So it's like, it's another world also, which is inside of a film. So that's a very unique setting, which is a horror film set in like 1878. So I do a mixture of traditional settings, historical settings, and then I do have like the underworld, which is traditional world building. I didn't have any experience with a circus in hell, at least not yet. So that was very different for me. And the settings for me just kind of represent obstacles that my characters have to surmount. So most of my books are I take people, my characters on journeys where they discover things and legacies that secret magical legacies that they have. And so I use the settings to kind of guide them through that.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Alex, how about
Sure.
you? Oh.
Whoops, there we go.
That mute button gets us all.
I'm Alex Jennings. My debut novel, The Ballad of Perilous Graves, came out a little over a year ago, last summer. And it is set both in a realistic version of New Orleans in 2018 and a timeless, eternal version of New Orleans called NOLA. So the city, people, culture, and music of New Orleans infuse the book, and I like to position the city as a character unto itself.
Cool. Alastair, how about you? Oh, it's in the bottom. The mute button's at the bottom towards the right.
Confirm.
There, you got it.
You got it.
Good. That took a yeah. I'm supposed to be the technical science fiction guy, right?
It's it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Al. I used to be a space scientist. Then I started writing science fiction as a kind of sideline, and that became my main thing. I've written about 20 novels, quite a few short stories, and the settings are all over the place. I mean, a lot of them are sort of entirely imaginary, so it's sort of like other planets off in the galaxy or in the far future. But I have written some stuff that's kind of in more sort of recognizable locales, although they're not quite real places. So I did a novel set in a version of 1950s Paris, but it wasn't quite our 1950s Paris. It was a sort of alternate history. And I've most recent novel, bits of it kind of take place in Norway, and bits of it kind of take place in Patagonia in the sort of 18th and 19th centuries, but it's not quite real history. So there's always a sort of filter that I seem to end up applying to my settings. But yeah, one of the things I love about science fiction is you can kind of go all over the place with it, and the whole of space and time is really at your disposal. So you can have so much fun with different settings.
Great, thank you. And Django?
Hi, I'm Django Wexler. I've written, I guess it's also coming up on 20 novels in a wide variety of settings. So I've written some that are pretty traditional fantasy, sort of knights and castles type settings. My first series, The Shadow Campaigns, was set in a kind of very lightly fantastical Napoleonic Wars setting that was sort of pretty historically grounded. My most recent series, Ashes of the Sun, is what I call a post-fantasy apocalypse, the sort of ruins of a high fantasy civilization. And then I've done some IP work. I've written a bunch of Magic the Gathering fiction, which is also a very interesting challenge setting-wise, because a lot of the setting is kind of handed to you, or has been done by previous authors. So it's a pretty wide range, and I've got some science fiction stuff coming up in a kind of far future milieu.
Cool. And I'm always curious. I get involved, especially with the covers and maps and things, pretty early on in the process of when we get the books, when we start working on the books. But for all of you, how early in the process are you thinking about setting? In some cases, Alex, like you said, your setting is really a character. Or for Connie, you said, your settings are really obstacles for your characters. At what point do you start with the setting? Do you start with the characters? Like where in the process does setting come in? Anybody could jump in, but Alex, maybe you could jump in first.
Yeah, the setting was a given. Like as soon as I had the idea for the book, a sort of blaxploitation Pippi Longstocking adventure set in a version of post-Katrina New Orleans, I knew that it had to grow from there. And I'm a transplant to New Orleans. I wasn't born and raised here, so it took me about 3 years after I moved here in 2006 to be comfortable setting stories here at all, just because the culture is unique, and the way people interact with history, and both recent history and history of the more distant past is just really, it's almost more old world European than it is in the rest of the US. And that really fired my imagination. So yeah, from the very beginning.
Cool.
And I will
anybody
say,
could jump
and
in. Connie, yeah.
oh, yeah. For The Star and the Strange Moon, I was really obsessed with this idea of, can a film steal your soul? And, kind of from some of the old, many people thought that a photo or, so naturally the next thing I was like, okay, well, I'm going to go back to Hollywood in the 1930s, which is kind of a mysterious time anyway, the beginnings of the genesis of film. There were all these, like, all of the stars were like, there were some mysterious deaths, and the studios tried to cover them up. So you have this kind of like weird, like lore, period of time there, which I like. It's mysterious and a little creepy. But then I started like running into the 60s. Every time I turned around, I'd have a Hammer film, or I'd have Francois d'Orléac, or I'd have something just kept pulling me into the 60s, which the setting then, and I do kind of include time as a setting there, that became the book, and that became a very, very different book. So the setting is probably, after the concept, the second thing that is, I mean, it's so important to me as a writer, and it is such a character. that it completely changed the book for me. And I dumped the old concept immediately because the new setting was more exciting. And I thought, like, French New Wave film, there aren't a ton of books out about like that period of time that were kind of using what I was trying to do, which like the Hammer films in the 1960s and that really gorgeous like Technicolor horror film. Like I thought that was fresh. So that's, again, setting very important.
Cool.
For me,
yeah.
I've had it go both ways. There are I've had some ideas which were very character based, and so I'm like, I know I want this character and I know I want them to do this, and so there's a lot of sort of tinkering with the setting to kind of get it to make that story work. And then I have also done it the other way, where I have an idea for a setting and kind of noodle around with characters to figure out what the sort of best way to show it off is. I have a file full of sort of orphaned ideas that didn't find their way into a book, and there's been times when I, had an idea for a character and sort of went through and looked at my past stuff and say, okay, where would it be interesting for them to be, or with this relationship, how would you make that work? So it can come either way for me, at least.
Oh, Al, how about you?
I think the method that sort of fits most of my books is I kind of just start writing. I mean, I have some sense of the setting when I start, but I've never really been able to sort of spend sort of 3 months sort of planning a book, sort of walking around the setting in my head before I start writing. I really want to dive in. So I tend to sort of start writing with sort of vague idea where I'm going from, and it'll often be I'll have a mental image of, say, a character in a predicament, and I want to know what they're doing, why are they where they are. Could be on a planet or in a spaceship or in 1950s Paris, but I don't necessarily know what's got them there and where they're going to go from that point on. So I sort of build out from that moment and then kind of discover the setting on the fly. And there's usually a point, when I start writing, it all feels a bit flimsy and artificial. But there comes a point generally in the writing where I've sort of layered enough texture in that it sort of the setting comes alive for me as the writer, and that's the point where I sort of start enjoying the process. But it's something that I don't know when that spark will happen, but at some point in the sort of creative process, there's a point where the setting gains enough texture and solidity to just feel like a real place to me, and then I know I'm good. I can keep on with what I'm working on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm cheating a bit because I know some of the answer for some of you. What tools do you use to keep track of your settings? I know different, there's a variance of how real world versus how completely artificially made up the settings are amongst all of your books. But are you sketching things on paper? Are you keeping track of things, or are you just kind of going with impressions? You start with somebody who's had a map.
Yeah. I've got a map right here, actually, because I don't normally work with maps, but the book I'm working on at the moment, it's a kind of, although it's science fiction, it's a kind of Raymond Chandler-esque murder mystery. And I felt I really had to get the mechanics of the murder had to be kind of nailed down and clear in my head before I started writing it. But also I need to get the location right. So it's sort of, I started with this, which is, it's not going to show up very well, but it's a kind of map of the inside of an enormous spaceship. And the sort of scale of the thing, in my head, it's kind of like, that's like Greater Los Angeles if you sort of rolled it into a tube. So it's kind of like, it's enough room for a kind of Philip Marlowe investigation where you've got, there's not just one city, there's several cities and towns, and there's roads connecting them, and there's woods and lakes and things where you can murder people. But I felt I had to have that reasonably nailed down before I started writing. But as I started writing, I started sort of doing, making little amendments to it and adding bits because, they need that there, don't they? Or I want to kill someone here. But certainly for that type of book, I wouldn't have felt confident about going into it without a map. I don't think any trace of that will appear in the final book. It's just a working document for me and as I write it. And
Okay.
a lot of my books have not required anything like that. But I think just purely because it's a murder mystery, I wanted to make sure it was all sort of nailed down, and I was really
Yeah,
clear in my head
absolutely.
about the locations before I sort of got too far into the plot.
Yeah.
Well, we
I
don't
mean,
do nearly enough maps with space, science. A lot of fantasy books have
space
maps, but
maps.
not a lot of sci-fi fantasy books have, sci-fi books have
Well,
maps.
because
So
it's even worse than that, because it's
here's
a
our
sort of
opportunity.
it's a spaceship that's a sort of it's a cylinder. So I've been sitting in my office, so with this piece of paper, sort of rolling it into a tube, and sort of looking down,
That's
trying
great.
to
Oh my
work
God,
out
that's amazing.
what the protagonist would see. But yeah,
You need
Oh,
a
that's so
toy.
cool.
yeah,
I
I
You
thought
need the
about making
toy or like a
yeah,
Lego that
yeah,
you
I
can
thought
do.
about
Yeah.
that. Don't give
Amazing.
me an
And I
excuse to
know,
play with Lego. That's terrible. Get
I
no
mean, I'm
writing
already
class.
having marketing ideas. We can just print out the maps
Yeah.
and have people look through them. Um, Alex, we did a map for you, and that was really fun. How were you plotting things out? I mean, you obviously it's based on a real place, but NOLA is not as true to New Orleans all the time.
Right. I mean, the geography of the imaginary city is relatively consistent with the geography of New Orleans, but there are some points of deviation. Like, for instance, there's a whole gigantic neighborhood called the Dead Side of Town, which is contiguous with the regular city, but at the same time, it's separate. And the geographical details of the Dead Side are a lot more impressionistic and tend to shift around based on whatever is happening and what the needs of the story are. And in my next book, I'll be delving into that a lot more, even though it's not directly related to Perilous Graves. But yeah, so I knew that learning the landscape of the book was also going to be learning the geography of the real New Orleans. But one thing that complicated matters is that there's a phrase that comes up in conversation with New Orleanians all the time, and that's "ain't there no more." And people will discuss landmarks that have long since passed, streets that have changed names, things like that. And so the creation of the Dead Side of Town was kind of a response to that. But on another level, it was just also something that I dreamed one night. And so I had to connect it in my mind.
And I will say, no spoilers, but there's much better public transportation, I feel like, in NOLA than in New Orleans. So
True.
I was very jealous. I'm a big fan of New Orleans, and I kind of wish I had that transport system when
Me
I
too.
visited. Connie, how about you?
Well, for the Secret Circus, which I think was the biggest departure that I had from like some of my traditional settings. I mean, I wanted it to feel dizzy. She steps out of Paris and she off the streets of Paris and she goes into this other world. And like I said, I wanted the effect to be dizzying. And for building, it was just important for me. I didn't feel like y'all have maps. I just wanted to sketch out the universe, and I had to see it visually in order to write about it. So what I tend to do is, either create a paper mood board, or if you go to my Pinterest site, you'll see I am like literally you can find anything. You can find a red river. You don't necessarily want to find a red river, but you can find for the river Styx, which the Ferris wheel takes you down into the river Styx. I mean, and everything is reversed from what we see. So I wanted to see that. And so it was very important for me so you'll see like I have all of the acts in the circus and I have everything that's like weird. I needed to have that in my head. So I paint first and then I write. So I had to paint it. So rather than a map, I had to actually like visually, it's the most important thing for me that I do is I take the time to then look visually. It's like, okay, this is generally what I think I want. And I don't care so much about where the space is. I will if it's down a hallway or this or that, that's not what I'm looking for, or down the street. But it's like in this contained circus, I needed to visually see color, costume, texture, pop, all of that. And so that to me became very important. But like I said, I'm on Constance Sayers on Pinterest, and you'll see that I have like very strange Pinterest boards because I need those to basically get myself prepared to write a setting that is in a different world.
Yeah, the art department loves getting Pinterest boards from authors, I have to say. I'm a big fan. Django, how about you?
So my training background is as a tabletop RPG DM. And so I'm a map guy I have no artistic talent, so my maps look terrible, but I sort of sketch things out on millimeter graph paper. So this is for a project that is not announced yet, but they look like this. So excuse me. And mostly it's for I use a pretty strict scale, so it's mostly for things like times and distances. There's a lot of how far apart are these two cities? Especially, it depends on the setting, but if I'm doing a book like The Shadow Campaigns, which is a sort of Napoleonic campaign type of thing, how far long it takes to march between city A and city B is like super important. And so that has to come into play. But yeah, there's definitely a straight line between me doing the setting for a world now and the stuff I drew in my little notebook when I was 17 and doing a D&D campaign for my friends.
Have you ever made a campaign in the world of one of your books that you've come up with?
I don't run much gaming anymore. I haven't for years because the scheduling demands of adulthood are too hard. So no, I haven't. Other people have, and sometimes they tell me about it, which is fun. Ultimately, I feel like I first got into writing because I was frustrated with trying to run RPGs because the characters wouldn't do what I wanted them to do. So it would feel like a step backward in some ways.
Yeah, having all these rowdy people running your characters.
I know, it's very hard.
Well, all of you in your own ways, there's elements of, to varying degrees, the real world versus completely made up fantasy worlds. Al, there's, maybe the exact spaceships haven't existed yet that you've been set on. But the idea of spaceships exist and how close they are, how constricting they are versus how big they are versus whether they're a tube or not. And we were talking about New Orleans and Paris and things like that. How do you guys feel like how do you balance what's grounded in the real world or a reader is gonna recognize as something maybe they're seen before or heard about or things like that, or maybe referenced in their mind versus being able to be completely free and made up out of the blue? How do you guys deal with that?
I knew I wanted it to, the setting to function on multiple levels, both for NOLA and for New Orleans. I wanted the city of NOLA to be sort of unmoored in time because it's situated in eternity, and it's a melange of a lot of different eras of New Orleans. So I knew that I wanted to take bits and pieces of musical and cultural lore and sort of fuse them all together. And if things were beginning to go too far afield, I would sort of shunt them over to the dead side of town because I had more leeway to like go off the reservation basically and decide where I wanted everything to be. But there were also some little bits that I would throw in for fun, like just the way details will come to you in dreams. Some of them made it into the book, and some of them didn't. Like for instance, there's a street here in New Orleans called Ferret Street, and I always knew that I wanted to include a ferret street where everybody who lives along it is a talking ferret, like in Narnia. But that didn't make it in.
I mean,
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
No.
For me, I don't write anything that is sort of set in real life, but I use a lot of historical research as a starting place. I think it's a really good way, rather than restrictive, it's a good sort of set of examples. If you look at the sort of sweep of history, it can tell you a lot about how people have solved a particular problem. If you have a place where there's no water and they live in the desert, if you look back at history, you can see all different peoples have had various approaches to living in a place like that, and that sort of really gives you an idea of what things you would have to think about, if nothing else, if you don't just sort of crib uh, directly. And so it's less restrictive and more like a kind of giant toolbox of ideas to work with.
Cool.
I'm pretty faithful. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm pretty faithful to, like, because when I'm writing historical, I'm trying to be very as historically accurate as I can. And it never fails that after a book is published, I get somebody telling me that I'm 6 months off of something, or that I've got this, wrong by 3 months or whatever, and I really do try to make that as accurate as possible, because the magic system is what I'm messing with. So I like the fact that that it's like, okay, you feel like you're reading something that's like you've picked up a historical novel, and then the fantasy kind of comes in and surprises you, or the magical realism, whatever you want to kind of call it. And I do kind of straddle, I sit on enough panels for the Historical Novel Society where you can head down a path there, but like I've said, like these folks are like writing historical tomes, and you don't want that. I mean, and I think that is like, so I will try to do the best that I can, but I'll give you like two specific examples. The last duel, I love duels. They're great, and they're great devices. And the last duel that kind of happened probably didn't, I needed it to be 1896, and it was probably 1878. And so I was like, whatever. I'm sure there was a duel going on somewhere in Paris. And so I kind of bent that a little bit. But and then like Agua Caliente was a very big part of it was a racetrack in Tijuana back in the 1930s. I mean, it has been erased from history. You can only find it on one film that if you want to see. So I watched that film, and so then I kind of painted. That's when it's like, you're kind of like, just like, that doesn't exist anymore. So I have to recreate it, because so I think it's a balance. But if I am being in history, I'm really trying to be faithful, so that the reader feels that they trust me on that. And then when I'm bending the magic and stuff, then it's like, whoa, that came out of nowhere, but it kind of works. So I think if I were doing all of it, I don't think it would work for me.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Al, do you want to get in on that, or should we?
I feel obviously doing the sort of setting the scene for a story set on a spaceship it's one thing, and I've written stories where the spaceship is a very small thing, and I try to sort of have like mental shorthand for myself. So I say, okay, it's about the size of a 737 or something like that. So I don't have characters taking 20 minutes to walk from one end to the other. But there are all sorts of sort of little tricks that I can use in the writing process to make sure I keep things more or less clear in my head. But I don't like to overload the reader with that. I like 99% of the research to be behind the scenes. But I was thinking about when I wrote the book of mine that's sort of set in Paris, because obviously many people have been to Paris and they have wrong notes are going to stand out. And I'd been to Paris quite a few times, and I really love Paris. But I thought I didn't want to put too much in, and I didn't want to put too little. So what I did, I read a bunch of Maigret novels by Georges Simenon, and I'd like those novels anyway. But what I was kind of, apart from the sort of mechanics of the detective stories in the books, I was also paying attention to what he didn't put in, and that was really interesting, because they're novels that are really sort of steeped in the atmosphere of Paris in sort of 1940s and 50s. But he almost never tells you what type of car they're driving and stuff like that. And he's very sketchy about the locations, but he'll spend a long time telling you what the interior of a bar looks like. And I thought, well, if I kind of just do what Simenon's doing, at least I've got a shot at getting the atmosphere across that I want. I wanted that sort of foggy noir post-war ambience, and I wasn't particularly concerned. You know, when I picked where my detective was going to have his office, I just got a big map of Paris and I just looked for a street name that I liked. And I didn't really care whether that was the kind of street that would have the right sort of tenement on it. I just said, no, that's where he lives. And I'd allowed myself, there was a certain amount of latitude because there was a little bit of alternate history coming in. But that's it's not really characteristic of the type of writing, I suppose. But yeah, it was interesting. I would find it very difficult to write authentically about a place I've not visited, like New Orleans, for instance. Even though there were loads of jazz stuff in the Paris books, but that was all about gypsy jazz, and you know that was part of the Parisian music scene as well. But yeah, so it can be a very different process if you know, generating a setting for a city as opposed to a spaceship can be very, very different. But that's what keeps it fresh and interesting, I think.
Yeah, and since we are talking, you know, this is a series about speaking to people who are writing or learning to write, especially early in their writing career, maybe their first novel. A lot of questions come up, and I've been seeing them come up in the chat, so this will be a good segue into the set questions. But how do you manage descriptions, you know, where you're not, you know, just straight info dumping, or maybe you are, you know, at the beginning of a novel? How do you manage the level? Al, you got into a little bit. How do you manage the level of like outright description versus atmosphere versus you know, implication when you're writing? How much do you know, want to reveal to the reader up front? Do you want to, like, you know, concretely set them someplace, or do you want them to kind of pick it up as they go along?
Well, I think it kind of depends on, do they know the setting or not? So like if the character is like got dumped into the setting, you know, it's like then they're taking it in, and then you can kind of be like, you know, as they're seeing the details. If it's something that's like, you know, every day for them, if they live in Paris every day, and it's like, I mean, then it's like the little details. It's the little things that you can micro. You know, sometimes it's, I love to just pick a little thing, and then there are like things around it that you can kind of do, because you're right, you can't really data dump. I mean, I might in an early draft, but you know, your editors are going to suss that out and get rid of that pretty quick, you know, pretty easily. So I think that is, I think it's a challenge, but I think it depends on the perspective of your character, and I think, you know, the relationship of your character to the setting that you've chosen is really important. Like, you know, and in my case, is like, yeah, I've said before, like the setting is an obstacle that they must. So in some cases, it's like they've outgrown one setting. In the next case, then it's like, you know, this setting is intimidating or overwhelming, and then the other setting is dizzying. So it's like as they head on this journey and they get to the end of it, it's just like, you know, so it's okay if you walk into a setting that is like completely overwhelming in the details, and then you are kind of describing every little thing. Even down to, I will say, one of the things that was most helpful to me, and I actually have it here, is, you know, you can read all about Paris in the 1920s, and I did. I mean, all my books down there have shelves just devoted to it. This was a cool little thing. This is about food, the found meals of the lost generation. This is what Hemingway ate, not what he ate. And like, I have to say, one of my things I love to do it took me months to research the desserts found at the Brown Derby in 1945. I don't know why I cared, but I did. And it's Cherry's Jubilee. I mean, I could have written like he had some cheesecake, you know, but I don't know, the Cherry's Jubilee, or the fact that, like, you know, like what exactly was available that Hemingway was eating, felt to me like a really beautiful detail versus like, and now we're heading down the Champs-Elysees, and now we're doing it, you know. So it's like, it's also those offbeat details. Like, don't just go directly down to, like, you're not writing a tourist brochure. You're kind of bringing Paris to life in a way that's a little offbeat. I don't know that. So those are just some of the things that I like tend to do.
Yeah, I think that for me, there's two important things. There's exactly what Connie said, like POV is the most important. You know, if you have a character, gets into a car, and that character is like an alien from another planet, like the things they're going to notice about the car, like the weird way that seat belts work and the little toggle buttons and like all that stuff. Whereas like if it's a seasoned detective gets into a car, he might notice, well, it's a BMW and that's expensive, but it's kind of older, so maybe he's fallen on hard times. And like, it's all about what that character sees, because then you can use your descriptions to inform the character, which is like obviously sort of why we're here in the long run. So that's about half of it. And the other half is what the reader is actually interested in, which is, I think, especially important in a kind of fantastic setting. It's really easy to overload the reader with details that they don't care about yet, because the details sort of come before the reason to care, and that's a really good way to lose your readers. Excuse me. The best way that I've found to get around the info dump problem is to just think about when in the story the readers want this information. When are they eager to hear what a spaceship can do or how this magic works, and then put the information there, and no one will object, right? You can info dump all you want because they want it.
Right. And I also like to consider the difference between giving the audience what they want and giving them what they need. When I was a teenager, I saw this terrible video of a guy who had broken into a junkyard and was attacked by a junkyard dog. And of course, like, all this is on video with no sound from an unmanned security camera. So the camera would pan automatically. And because there was no intelligence behind it, it made the whole thing all the scarier and more terrible, because it wasn't focused on the action. And so that made a real serious impression on me. And I use that sort of effect in horror, but I also use it in my fantasy work as well. Because I find that like little tricks and flourishes like that can really enhance the reader's experience.
Cool. And that actually, as we move on to the crowd questions, that segues great. And I think, Connie, you already started answering this. Is there any one type of description detail that nails authenticity for you? I feel like, Connie, you were talking about the cherries jubilee and the food.
Yeah, I mean, food is really important. I mean, like, yeah, it's like, you can look at a map and like, let's say we're talking like Paris 1925. You can look at a map, you can look at what has changed, and and you have to do some research to kind of figure out like what was on that street at the time. And so that's one thing. But like there are things that I did hire a Louvre guide to take me around to kind of talk to me about what would have been the traditions and the customs of the time. Like a woman couldn't walk down the street in 1896 by herself and be considered a lady. So that's when I had my character dress up as a man to get out. I mean, so little things like that I think are details that are really important. But food and clothing, I mean, I do a lot, like I have to dress my characters also before I can like move them around. And so there are just like weird little things, and maybe it's just my quirk, but I need to know, in addition to like what the room looks like, what the street looks like, I have to understand what they're eating and what they're wearing, and just like those little customs that if you don't know will trip you up. I mean, I couldn't, I couldn't have a woman in 1896 Paris walking down the street by herself. Otherwise, there are implications to who she is. So, I mean, there are just little things like that I think that you have to spend the time. If you're doing something like that, I mean, obviously you don't have to do it if it's like modern day, it's your interpretation. But if you are trying to be historically accurate, I think you have to do those types of things. And I also think, Alastair said it, I don't tend to write about a setting if I am writing about a legit true setting unless I have been there and walked those streets, because there's also just little things that you pick up about the sound of the traffic or the smell of a place. And so I think that is really very important. So every place I've ever written about, I just won't write about it unless I've been there, with the exception of seventh layer of hell. Have not been there.
Yeah.
Hoping to not.
Oh yeah, go.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say anybody else. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean, in some sense, this is just a hard problem. That's like one of the key things you do as a writer is sort of think about what detail is going to convey this place, this moment to the reader. So there's not like an easy answer to it, but as Connie was saying, I think a good place to start is how things feel as opposed to sort of the facts, right? That, I can write, the spaceship works in thus and such a way, it has anti-gravity or whatever, or, the army marched from here to there. But thinking about how that feels for the person experiencing it, how stepping from one doorway to another, you feel a tweak in the artificial gravity, or what it's like to march through fields and steal food from the peasants who live there and stuff like that is more important in some sense to give that flavor.
Right. Yeah, and food is such an important part of that, especially when you are depicting a specific culture at a specific time, because food is it's very political. It's also very common, and it can illuminate class and all sorts of other things at the same time. So, food is very important in New Orleans. Like we are a kind of culture that while you're having one meal, you're often discussing the next one. There are a lot of arguments over what constitutes a real gumbo, and then you have the tension between Cajun and Creole cuisines. So, like, exploring and illuminating those things really helps to locate a story in its time and place.
And just you feel authentic. I mean, there's this great Kiki, Man Ray's girlfriend, Kiki, from the Lost Generation back in 1925. She was so poor that she would steal food, and she would also steal the dishes out of some of the cafes. And so you would go to her house, and you would eat off of like the cafe china because she would have stolen it all. And I mean, that's a great, oh my God. I mean, that is like, and I actually did like that was something I heard historically. And I like kind of did use that because I thought it was just such a sweet, because these artists were poor. They had left and gone to Montparnasse because, Montmartre was too expensive. And so like, that, to your point, like class and food, I mean, and political, it's so, it's such a entangled, wonderful detail. And so those are just things I think that really also are very authentic. And I think that you kind of move the story along with something that I think was very telling about the time.
Yeah. For the folks in the room that have come up with completely, fantastical or made up or science fiction, not based in reality, settings. How do you kind of make something feel authentic when it's something that you've kind of made up?
Well, I was reading a book, a long time ago by Stanislaw Lem, the Polish science fiction writer, and there was a scene where there were two astronauts or space engineers on a planet somewhere. One of them had just come out of the spaceship, and the other guy was maybe the service engineer, and they were interacting. And I'd probably read countless scenes that were kind of like similar to that in Asimov and Clarke, but there was a quotidian detail in the Lem story that just immediately worked for me, and that was one of the characters was trying to cadge a cigarette off the other guy, and so he sort of said, "Have you got a cigarette?" And the other guy did that. And this is all described in the story. He did that thing where he pats himself because he can't quite remember where he's put his packet of cigarettes. And I thought that, okay, setting aside whether people would still be smoking in the 21st century, it was such a universal human detail that it immediately made that scene feel completely real to me. And from that point on, I was fully invested in the characters. So when I'm writing things that might be set sort of half a million years in the future, I'm always sort of, my antennae are always on the lookout for just those little human moments. Like if people eat bread, they're still going to get crumbs on their lap, aren't they? So they're still going to sort of go, oh, I've got crumbs on me now. So those are the details I look to bring into a narrative to ground it when the location might be quite exotic or far-fetched. So those little sort of universal human moments, I suppose you'd call them.
Yeah, that's a great point.
They don't come without work, though. It does take quite a bit of effort on the part of the writer to sort of find them and sort of insert them into the story. Otherwise, you just get endless he said, she said, which is like an Isaac Asimov scene where everyone's just standing around in a grey room discussing the fate of the universe.
And to expand on that just a little, I think one of the really neat things you can do in sci-fi fantasy that always I love is when sort of finding those human universals and twisting them slightly for the setting. So, if somebody is, patting their chest to try to figure out where their cigarettes are, maybe the patting gesture is different because everybody is wearing spacesuits and they have external pockets. James Corey's The Expanse is fantastic at this, the way he depicts the belt culture, the sort of mix of human universals that we can clearly recognize, but sort of altered for a culture that mostly lives in space and wears spacesuits and so on.
But everyone still needs their coffee.
Right, exactly. And so it's like, what's the equivalent of getting crumbs on your chest if you're eating, ration bars, because you're living in some horrible dystopia.
Yeah. Actually, Django, I have a question for you.
Sure.
I think I'm not wrong in saying that, especially in the Ashes of the World book and trilogy, you had to deal with a setting that was not just a fantastical setting, but also a ruined fantastical setting. So for all the post-apocalyptic fans in the room, how did you deal with your own characters dealing with a layered kind of ruin situation?
I mean, that was sort of one of the attractions of the setting to me. I really wanted it to be like in a lot of fantasy settings, there was some ancient civilization that is no longer with us because, medieval Europe has these vestigial Roman Empire vibes. But it's usually just like there's a ruin in the corner in the ancient wilderness. And otherwise it doesn't really impact our daily life that much. And in Ashes of the Sun, I wanted it to be more like if our civilization had collapsed and people were sort of living among the wreckage. So there's just junk everywhere, all this stuff. And so the most important bit of detail is that everything is sort of repurposed, right? Because the past civilization made, metal that can't be broken and, artifacts that do things no one can do anymore. And none of it is still being used for its original purpose, but it's all so useful that it's still being used for something. That we've taken, the spokes and cogs of some ancient machine and built, an elevator out of it because the cables are indestructible and you can use it to lift rocks up and down, stuff like that. So sort of thinking about how things get used for new purposes was a big part of it.
That's really cool. We have a question here about knowing how people can affect the world they inhabit. How much do you weave in like ecology and biodiversity? Do you think about it? Do you think about the non-human characters in the setting and maybe the, plant and animal life as well?
I mean, not to just go on and on, but I sure do. It's I feel like it's more relevant in like your sort of classical fantasy setting than in NOLA or in 1950s Paris, that rather, or I guess 500,000 years in the future. But in the kind of standard issue Knights and Castles fantasy, that often has a really big impact, especially the kind of fantastical part of it. Dark Lord is in fact arguably about exactly that, the sort of interaction between humans other intelligent life and natural creatures.
Right. One of the things that I do when I'm considering a new setting is try and come up with an idea of what the average day is like for the average person. And if you look at the lives that we lead, you see that our day to day experience involves a tapestry of influences and circumstances that we don't necessarily directly consider all the time. So if I'm doing something set on some far flung planet, I have to ask myself, okay, so how does ecology, the environment, biodiversity influence, say, the economy? And how are people making money? How does one region differ from another in on this world? And how does that influence history? How does it influence the conscious thinking of my characters? How does it involve the unusual events of the story that make this more than a collection of things that happened? And that's always a solid foundation to start.
Cool. We only have a few minutes left, so I think a good way to wrap up here, although we've answered a little bit of a lot of the questions that are in from the crowd. But I will say one thing everybody that's in this watching this series is hungry for is advice. So what's the one piece of advice you have on crafting settings for your characters and revealing that to the readers that you would like most want to pass on to the folks that are watching this? And as readers yourself, because in the future you might be reading some of these books.
Well, when I was trying to break into science fiction, back when I was a student, I sent a few stories off to some of the science fiction magazines and I hadn't got anywhere. They were rejecting my stuff. And I thought, what if I try and write a story with a setting that they'll never have seen before? Or even if it's a really bad story, at least it'll be an original setting and it might just catch their eye. So I went to the university library and I found there was like a stack of books about Inuit culture on one of the shelves, you know. So I took them all out and I read sort of them to some degree, and I wrote a story that was centered around Inuit culture. And I thought, I bet you they haven't had a science fiction story about Inuit culture lately. And I sent it to the magazine and they rejected it, but then they said, try it again. So I sent them the same story, sort of polished a bit, and that was my first sale. So my advice would be maybe just read a bit out of the box. You know, don't just read the stuff. I mean, to write any kind of fiction, I think it helps to kind of just try and get out of the kind of group thing that maybe all the other writers are in. Just try and bring some, you know, unique perspective or insight into your fiction that is not likely to have been something that everybody else will have come across, and that's usually achieved by just reading, you know, omnivorously and you know, with an interest in finding the interesting weird stuff.
Setting is wonderful, and I think it's very important. I mean, obviously, it's one of the first things I go to in terms of what I'm going to do with it. But I really do, at the end of the day, think that it is your characters that, like, I've, you know, created these elaborate settings, and I think that they do, like, make my books stand out. Like people know that about. But at the end of the day, when people write to me and say, like, I love this book, it's because of Helen and Luke. It's Laura, and, you know, it is the characters and the belief that, you know. So maybe it is the way they're interacting, but I really think that, you know, depending upon whether it's historical or you're doing a fantasy world building setting, at the end of the day, it's the characters that you connect with. So just don't forget that, because, you know, that is you've got to believe in the story. The story has to make you ache. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't matter where it's set. It doesn't matter what time period it's set. It doesn't matter if it's accurate or they've got Cherry's Jubilee or not. It's not gonna connect. And I just think that that's really, at the end of the day, what you're looking for. Right. I still read A Witch in Time and I cry at the end of A Witch in Time. I know what's happening. And I still cry because it just gut punches me at the end. And that is what you want that from your book.
I mean, most writing advice is covered by the idea of reading as actively and as extensively as you can, and writing as actively and extensively as you can. Um, but at the end of the day, the thing that's really going to connect you with readers is the emotional core, the emotionality. So
Mm-hmm.
everything is subordinate to that. And I do think that sometimes the point gets lost in discussions of setting and world building. Like, really what you're trying to do is create the world, like paint it realistically enough that your readers feel like that they can inhabit it, like that they believe it. And it doesn't always have to make perfect logical sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo what other people said. I mean, for me, the two important things, important pieces of advice setting wise. First, make sure that your setting is supporting the story you want to tell and not fighting it, especially if you are writing in a fantasy world or a science fictional world where you have a lot of control over the sort of basic laws of physics or rules of magic or how the technology works or whatever it is. You have an opportunity to make your setting sort of help you tell the story you want to tell. So it helps a lot to figure out what the story you want to tell is, and have the setting work there. Like, I don't mean to be like super convenient for your characters, but it supports your point. The example I use is in the Shadow campaigns, because the story I want to tell is about this sort of marching armies and Napoleonic warfare. It wouldn't, when I'm designing the magic system, it wouldn't work to have a magic system like, for example, Wheel of Time, where a single magician can decimate an army by waving his hand, because it would make all that kind of military stuff feel sort of irrelevant. So the magic system has to be much more personal and intimate. And otherwise, you're going to spend the whole book sort of justifying why your characters can't do a thing. And so that's, just taking a bit to think about it at the start and make sure the setting is on your side. And then the other one, to sort of echo what a couple other people have said, you can take working on your setting too far. You don't have to fix, get everything set in stone. You can fill things in as you go along. The great thing about writing is you're not doing it live. You can always go back and change things. And it's a very common failure mode among newer writers to sort of get caught up in world building and never actually write anything. And so you have to avoid that. You have to start the book at some point. So don't, George R.R. Martin may be able to write like a 1,000-page tome with the life history of every character in the kingdom, but most of us can't operate that way.
And the
Awesome.
same with history. You can go down a historical rabbit hole and never write the book, and keep doing your research. And sometimes you just have to put insert this here. I'll do this all the time. Insert this here, move on and write the story, so.
Yeah, of course. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We're at time. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day and your deadlines. I know some of you are on deadline. For helping and inspiring a new generation of authors. And I will direct everyone's attention to the teal green button if you would like to be linked to the author's books. Check out their books, especially since we've been hearing about such fascinating settings. And you can see the rest of the sessions that are recorded and are still coming up in these series. And thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the authors. Thank you to the crowd. There's some great questions in here. I wish we had time to get to more of them. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.